The Galactic Conclave Station was a massive ring of metal and light that floated in the empty space between stars. It had no home planet. It belonged to no single race. It was supposed to belong to all of them equally. That was the idea, anyway. The reality was a little different. 12 races sat on the council. 12 races voted on the laws that govern trade, war, borders, and peace across hundreds of star systems. And for 200 years, humanity had sat at that table, followed the rules, paid its dues, and done the work that nobody else wanted to do. Ambassador Sarah Voss walked through the long corridor toward the Chamber of 12. She was a tall woman, with short gray hair and calm brown eyes. She had spent 30 years of her life in diplomacy. She had negotiated ceasefires between species that wanted nothing more than to tear each other apart. She had signed treaties in rooms that smelled of alien chemicals and strange gases. She had smiled through insults, sat through delays, and swallowed her anger more times than she could count. Today, she was done swallowing. Behind her walked 6 members of her diplomatic team, all dressed in the deep blue of Earth's Foreign Office. Their faces were steady. None of them looked afraid. They had talked about this moment for months. They were ready. The Chamber of 12 was a large, circular room with high ceilings. Each of the 12 council races had a raised platform, with their delegations seated behind curved desks. The Vethari sat highest of all, at the very top of the chamber. High Arbiter Vetha was already in her seat, her gray scaled fingers folded on the desk in front of her, her narrow yellow eyes watching Sarah as she walked in. The other delegations were already seated. The Keth, with their wide flat faces and merchant robes. The Usulari, thin and pale, always whispering among themselves. The Tauric, armored even in a diplomatic chamber, their heavy bodies barely fitting in their chairs. 10 other races, and then humanity, taking the last platform at the bottom of the chamber. Sarah had never liked that. The bottom platform. It had always felt intentional. She stood at the podium and looked up at the chamber. Her voice was calm and clear when she spoke. She explained humanity's position simply. The outer veil was a stretch of dead and unclaimed star systems beyond the Council's mapped territory. Humanity had surveyed it. Humanity had found it useful. Humanity wanted to expand into it and call it sovereign human territory. That was the request. It was not complicated. It was not aggressive. It was simply space that no one had claimed, that humanity had already done the work of mapping. High Arbiter Vetha spoke next. Her voice came through the translation device as smooth and cold as still water. She said that the outer veil was a matter of collective council interest. She said that no single race could simply claim unclaimed territory without full council approval. She said that the process would need to be reviewed, studied, discussed across multiple sessions, and then voted on, over the course of perhaps 2 or 3 years. Sarah had heard this kind of language before. It meant no. It just meant no, in a long and expensive way. She asked for an immediate vote, the chamber murmured. High Arbiter Vetha looked faintly amused. She allowed it. The vote went 10 against, 2 in favor. The only 2 votes for humanity came from the Orath representative, a small insectoid delegate who had always been quiet and polite, and from the Keth junior envoy, who looked nervous the moment he pressed his vote, and then looked at his senior delegate with wide eyes, clearly regretting it. Sarah stood at the podium for a moment after the result was announced. She looked up at the chamber. She looked at High Arbiter Vetha, who was already turning to speak to her aide about something else entirely, as if the vote had been nothing. As if humanity had been nothing. Sarah reached down and picked up her diplomatic seal from the podium. It was a heavy disc of polished metal engraved with Earth's crest. She set it down on the desk beside the podium, with a quiet, final sound. Then she said it. Not loudly, not with anger, just clearly, so that every translation device in the room would carry it perfectly. Then you will learn what you replaced. She turned and walked out. Her team followed. No one in the chamber said anything for a moment. Then High Arbiter Vetha laughed. It was a short, dry sound. A few others laughed with her. The Orath delegate did not laugh. It sat very still and watched the door where the humans had gone. The human delegation boarded their ships within 3 hours. Admiral Jonas Reth was already waiting in orbit aboard the carrier Times Endurance, a long and dark vessel that carried more firepower than most council member fleets combined. Reth was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and a face that had been weathered by 20 years in space. He was not a man who showed much on his face. But when Sarah came aboard and told him the vote was over, something moved behind his eyes. Something quiet and heavy. He gave the order. Every human ship in Council space began to move. Not in a rush, not in panic. They moved with slow, deliberate purpose, like something very large deciding to leave a room. There were over 400 human vessels in Council space at any given time. Freighters, warships, medical ships, engineering craft, patrol boats. They all moved. The human engineers aboard Council stations collected their tools, packed their personal belongings, and left. The human medics in the shared health facilities on the Conclave station gathered their equipment and departed without a word. The human navigators, who had been guiding ships through the rift corridors for decades, signed off their stations and handed nothing to anyone because there was no one trained to take over. The rift corridors were complex, dangerous pathways through unstable space. They had been built and maintained by human engineers using technology the Council had never fully understood or learned. The Council had never needed to understand it. Humans were always there. By the time the last human ship crossed out of Council space, 6 days had passed. The Council had said nothing official. Some of its members had sent quiet messages to the human ships, asking if negotiations could continue. Reth ignored them on Sarah's orders. They were not running. They were not negotiating. They were simply leaving. On the 9th day, the first rift corridor began to destabilize. It was a minor corridor, a short route between 2 small trading stations. No ships were inside it when it failed. No one was hurt. But the people who ran those trading stations looked at the dark and broken space where the corridor had been, and then looked at each other, and began to understand something for the first time. Humanity had not been sitting at the bottom of that chamber for 200 years because they were weak. They had been sitting there because they were patient. That patience was now over. Nobody expected silence to hurt so much. That was the thing about humanity's departure. It did not come with fire or noise. There were no warning shots, no angry speeches broadcast across the communication networks, no threats, just the slow, steady emptying of every human face from every human post across Council space. And then, the quiet. At first, the Council did nothing. High Arbiter Vetha released a short public statement saying that the situation was being monitored, that Council operations would continue without interruption, and that humanity's decision was regrettable but manageable. The statement was calm and well-worded. Several Council members agreed with it publicly. Privately, they were already afraid. The first real sign of trouble came from the rift corridors. There were 47 of them, stretching across Council space, like invisible rivers between the stars. Ships used them to cut travel time from weeks to hours. Trade depended on them. Troop movements depended on them. The entire economy of the Council was built around the assumption that the rift corridors would always be there, always open, always safe. They were not built to run without maintenance. Nobody had ever thought about that, because the humans had always been there to maintain them. Within 2 weeks of humanity's departure, 3 corridors showed instability readings. Automated warning systems lit up across the stations connected to those routes. Council engineers were dispatched to investigate. They arrived, looked at the systems, and sent back reports saying they did not fully understand the technology involved. The equipment was human-designed. The manuals were written in a human engineering language that even the translation systems struggled with, because it was filled with human-specific shorthand and references to internal systems that only trained human engineers would know. The Council asked its own engineers to improvise. They tried. One corridor was stabilized, but poorly, and began failing again within days. The other 2 were lost entirely. The cargo fleets that used those corridors were diverted. That added weeks to their journeys. Trade goods arrived late. Prices climbed. Station managers sent angry messages to Council administrators. Council administrators sent confused messages to each other. Then the Keth Mercantile Union declared a formal complaint. The Keth were traders above everything else. Their entire civilization was built around commerce. They had dozens of routes through the rift corridors, and they had also relied on human pilots to navigate the shear lanes, which were stretches of space near unstable stellar fields, where human ships and human instincts had always proven better than automated guidance. Without human pilots, 3 Keth cargo convoys had gone badly off course in the shear lanes within the first month. 1 ship was recovered after drifting for 11 days. 2 others were never found. The Keth senior merchant lord stood before the council and said very directly that this was the council's fault. He said that humanity had been allowed to become too deeply embedded in council operations, and that the council's leadership had failed to build redundancy. He said it loudly. He said it in front of cameras. The feed went across every major network in council space. High Arbiter Vetha was furious, but she could not argue with the numbers. Worse was still coming. On the border between Ysolari and Tauric space, there had been a frozen conflict for almost 30 years. A disputed cluster of 6 star systems, all of them valuable for their mineral deposits. The 2 races had come to the edge of war over it twice. Both times, human mediators had stepped in. Both times, agreements had been reached. Not permanent agreements, but agreements that kept the shooting from starting. The human mediators were gone. The Ysolari had been waiting. They had not been waiting politely. 3 weeks after humanity left, a Ysolari fleet crossed into the disputed cluster and began establishing positions on 2 of the 6 systems. The Tauric responded within days. The first battle killed 240 soldiers across both sides. The second battle, a week later, was worse. The Council sent its own peacekeeping force. It was a small fleet, assembled from member contributions, and its commanders had trained in a system designed by humans and supported by human logistics. Without that support, the fleet arrived late, with conflicting orders from 3 different council committees. It sat at the edge of the conflict zone and issued statements calling for calm. The Ysolari and Tauric ignored the statements and kept fighting. On the conclave station, the mood had changed completely. There were long meetings that went nowhere. There were arguments between council members that spilled out of closed chambers and into the corridors. The Keth envoy was seen shouting at a Vethari official near the central atrium. The Orath delegate, small and quiet as always, moved through these scenes without joining them, watching everything with its large, compound eyes. Meanwhile, the fringe civilizations were watching too. The fringe were a loose collection of smaller, younger species that lived on the edges of mapped space. They had never been invited into the council. Some of them had wanted to be. Others had simply stayed away, kept at a careful distance by a combination of council border patrols and the unofficial but very real reputation of the human fleet, which had a long history of responding to border provocations with swift and serious force. The human fleet was gone. A fringe scouting party crossed into a council border system and found no human patrol waiting for them. They sent a report back. Then a second scouting party went deeper. Then a small fringe vessel began circling a council mining outpost in what everyone understood to be a test. The council's border forces responded, but slowly, and without the confidence that came from knowing human ships were nearby as backup. The test had gone well for the fringe. More tests followed. Admiral Reth received the intelligence reports about all of this from his contacts still embedded in neutral space. He read them in his cabin aboard the Times, Endurance Times, while his fleet traveled steadily toward the outer veil. He did not smile at the news. He was not the kind of man who smiled at suffering, even the suffering of people who had voted against his species. But he noted every detail. He filed it. He shared the key points with Sarah Voss, who read them with her usual calm expression, her fingers folded on her desk. She had expected most of it. She had not expected the Ysolari-Tauric conflict to break out quite so fast, and that troubled her. People were dying because the Council had been too proud to accept a reasonable request from humanity. That was not something to feel good about. But she also knew something that the Council did not yet understand. The chaos spreading across their stars was not the result of some human plan to sabotage them. It was simply what happened when you removed the load-bearing wall from a building and then acted surprised when the ceiling started to crack. Humanity had not broken the Council. The Council had broken itself, slowly, over 200 years of taking human work for granted. Now the bill had come due, and humanity was not coming back to pay it for them. The outer veil did not look like much at first glance. That was the point. From a distance, it was a wide belt of dead and quiet systems. Old stars burning low, planets with cracked surfaces and thin atmospheres, drifting fields of rock and frozen gas. The kind of space that the Council's survey teams had looked at briefly, written off in their reports as having little value, and moved on from without a second thought. The Council had never looked closely enough, or perhaps, more honestly, they had never had anyone willing to do the hard work of looking closely enough. Humanity had. 17 years before Ciro Voss stood at that podium in the Chamber of 12. Earth had quietly sent its best geological and atmospheric survey teams into the outer veil under the cover of what was officially reported as long-range mapping exercises. The results of those surveys had never been shared with the Council. They had been filed in a secure archive on Earth, marked with a classification level that very few people were cleared to access. What the surveys found was not nothing. 3 planets in the outer veil had conditions that could be terraformed within a decade with the right equipment. 2 of them sat above mineral deposits so large and varied that their value was difficult to calculate. One system had an unusual type of stellar radiation that human physicists believed could, with the right kind of collection technology, be harvested as a near-infinite energy source. The Council had walked past a vault and never tried the door. When humanity arrived in the outer veil, they did not arrive unprepared. The colony ships were already loaded. The terraforming equipment was already packed. The engineering teams knew exactly where they were going, and exactly what they would find when they got there. It was not chaos. It was not scrambling. It was the execution of a plan that had been sitting in a drawer for 17 years, waiting for the right moment. Commander Ashen Kemderim stood on the observation deck of the construction platform, Times Vigil Times, and watched the skeleton of Bastion Villar rising in the black space around her. It was humanity's first deep space fortress, and it was being built fast. Her teams worked in 12-hour shifts. They did not complain. There was a kind of energy in the outer veil that Asha had not felt in a long time. A focused, serious energy that came from a group of people who knew exactly what they were doing and why it mattered. Asha was an engineer by training and a military commander by necessity. She was in her mid-40s, with dark skin, close-cropped hair, and a habit of walking the construction floors herself, rather than watching from screens. She liked to see things with her own eyes. She liked to talk to the people doing the work. It made her a good commander, and a popular one. She was looking at the outer hull sections of Bastion Velar being welded into place when her communication device buzzed. It was Admiral Reth, speaking from aboard the Times Endurance. He told her about the Orath. The Orath Collective was an insectoid species. They had 6 limbs, compound eyes, and a complex chemical communication system that worked alongside their spoken language. They were not large. They were not what most people would consider physically impressive. But they were extremely intelligent, excellent engineers in their own right, and they had been suffering under Council trade sanctions for almost 40 years. The sanctions had been pushed through by the Vethari Dominion, who considered the Orath a competitive threat in certain rare material markets. The Council had voted to impose the sanctions, and humanity, bound by Council rules at the time, had been unable to block them, though several human diplomats had argued loudly against the decision. The Orath had not forgotten that. When the Orath Collective's representative, a small and careful individual who gave its name in a sequence of chemical signals that translated roughly into a sound humans wrote, as Times, Venri, arrived at the outer edge of human space, it came alone, on a single small ship, with a white signal flag displayed. It asked, through a neutral relay station, to speak with someone in human leadership. Asha met Venri personally, floating in a small meeting pod attached to the side of the Times Vigil. The Orath sat across from her, its compound eyes moving slowly, its hands folded on the table in a gesture of openness that Asha's cultural briefing told her was a significant display of trust among its species. Venri said that the Orath had watched humanity leave the Council. It said that the Orath had been watching humanity for a long time, actually. It said that when humanity had argued against the trade sanctions all those years ago, the Orath Collective had recorded that fact and held it. It said that the Orath wanted to propose a partnership, not a one-sided arrangement, a real one. Resources, knowledge, and mutual defense. Asha listened to all of it. Then she asked Venri one question. She asked if the Orath was prepared to stand beside humanity, even if the Council came looking for trouble. Venri was quiet for a moment. Then it said that the Orath had been waiting for someone worth standing beside for 40 years. It was prepared to stand. Asha sent the full report to Sarah Voss that evening. Sarah read it carefully and approved negotiations immediately. Within 3 weeks, the framework of a bilateral agreement was drafted. The Outer Veil Compact was not yet a formal alliance, but it was becoming one. Other small species in the region had heard what happened with the Orath. Quiet messages began arriving at human relay stations. Careful inquiries. Careful offers. But not everything was going smoothly. Resources were being stretched. Building Bastion Valar, running the terraforming operations on 3 planets, and supplying a fleet of over 400 ships all at the same time, was a significant load even for humanity's industrial capacity. Rationing was discussed in some of the colony ships. Certain construction timelines were pushed back. And then the intelligence from Reth's contacts in neutral space arrived. And it was not good. High Arbiter Vetha had stopped trying to solve the Council's problems. She had started trying to solve her own problem, which was the damage that humanity's departure had done to her reputation and to the Vethari Dominion's standing among the other Council members. Several member races were now blaming her leadership for the crisis. She needed something to show her authority. She had put forward a classified motion in a closed council session. The motion used careful legal language, but what it said was simple. Humanity's secession was a destabilizing act. The Outer Veil territory was being claimed without Council authorization. Human military assets were a threat to Council security. The motion called for a punitive military expedition against human space. It passed 7-5. When Reth read that number, he was quiet for a long time. Then he began making calls. He had been expecting something like this. He had hoped for a little more time. He did not have more time, but he had something better. He had been ready. High Arbiter Vetha made the broadcast herself. She stood in the center of the Vathari command chamber, tall and sharp in her formal robes, and she addressed every major network in Council space. Her voice was steady. Her words were precise. She spoke about order. She spoke about the dangers of rogue civilizations acting outside the law. She spoke about the Council's responsibility to maintain stability across the stars. She did not say that she was afraid, but the people who knew her understood that she was. The Conclave Armada assembled over the course of 10 days. 340 warships drawn from 9 of the 12 Council member races. It was the largest military force the Council had put together in 3 centuries. The ships were large, well-armed, and crewed by thousands of soldiers who had been told that they were going to restore order and that the mission would be quick. The Keth declined to contribute ships. So did the Yusolari, still fighting their border war. So did the Orath, whose representative at the Council simply walked out when the vote was announced. That left 9 races sending ships, but the 9 were enough. 340 was a number that was meant to send a message before a single shot was fired. The Armada moved toward the Outer Veil in a broad formation, broadcasting its presence openly. This was also intentional. Vetha wanted humanity to see it coming. She wanted them to understand the size of what was coming for them. She wanted them to think about asking for talks. Aboard the Keth Observer vessel Time's Quiet Margin, a ship that was following the Armada at a careful distance without being part of it, Captain Daro Vel watched the fleet on his display screen. Vel was an older Keth, experienced and blunt, with the wide, flat face of his species and a reputation for saying uncomfortable things in formal settings. He had been sent to observe and report. He had not been sent to fight, which suited him well. He watched the 340 ships move through space and thought that they looked impressive. He also thought that they were heading toward the humans, and that in all his years of watching political situations go badly, he had never once seen a plan that assumed the other side would simply give up, turn out well. He noted his concerns in his log and kept watching. At the edge of the outer veil, at a place called the Shatter Margin, where old asteroid fields and broken planetary debris created a natural corridor into human space, Admiral Jonas Reth was waiting. He had 90 ships. They were arranged in a quiet, tight formation just inside the debris field, positioned so that their signatures were partially masked by the surrounding rock and mineral scatter. Reth stood on the bridge of the Times, Endurance Times, and watched the Armada's approach on the tactical display. 340 points of light moving toward him in a formation that was, he had to admit, well organized. The Council had invested in decent tactical coordinators. He did not feel nervous. He had spent the last 2 months doing very little else besides preparing for exactly this. Every commander in his fleet had their orders. Every ship had been checked, rechecked, and checked again. Every crew member knew what the plan was and what their role in it was. The plan was not to win a battle of numbers. You could not win a 4-to-1 fight by shooting harder than the other side. The plan was something different. The Armada reached the outer edge of the Shatter Margin and slowed. Their long-range sensors were showing them the 90 human ships sitting calmly in the debris field. There was a long pause. Then the Armada's flagship, a massive Vethari vessel called the Times Enduring Authority, opened a communication channel. The Vethari fleet admiral on the other end of the channel told Reth that the Council Armada had been authorized to enter the outer veil and escort the human fleet back to Council-designated space for formal proceedings. He said that resistance would be met with force. He said that humanity should stand down and allow the process to proceed peacefully. Reth listened to all of it without expression. Then he said, very simply, that the Armada was not authorized to enter the outer veil, that the outer veil was sovereign human territory, and that the fleet should turn around. The Armada did not turn around. It entered the Shatter Margin. What happened in the next 4 hours was studied by military analysts across the galaxy for years afterward. Humanity's electronic warfare systems activated the moment the Armada crossed the threshold. They had been designed over decades of studying every Council member species' technology. They knew the frequencies, the protocols, the communication architectures. The jamming was precise and total. Within minutes, the Armada's fleet-wide communication network was dead. Ships could not talk to each other except at very short range. The coordinated 340-ship formation stopped being a coordinated formation and became, very quickly, a collection of individual vessels trying to figure out what was happening. Then the human ships moved. They did not charge. They did not fire wildly. They moved in careful, fast groups of 4 and 5, targeting specific ships, disabling engines and weapons with surgical accuracy using focused energy weapons that the Council's armor was not designed to resist. Human ships were faster than anything in the Armada, not by a little, by a significant margin. They moved through the confused Armada formation like water through gaps in stone. Aboard the Times Enduring Authority, the Vethari fleet admiral was shouting into a communication device that was returning nothing but static. His screen was showing red damage reports from dozens of ships. He could see human vessels moving in formation on the tactical display, briefly visible before vanishing again into the debris field. He could not track them properly. He could not reach his wing commanders. He could not coordinate a response. Captain Darrow Vell, watching from the Times quiet margin times far behind, recorded everything. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said quietly to his first officer, "They were never in danger. Look at how they're moving. They're choosing which ships to disable. They're being careful." His first officer watched the display and understood what he meant. The human fleet was not fighting desperately. It was working. By the end of the 4th hour, 212 Council ships had been disabled or were retreating back through the Shatter Margin. Their crews were alive. Their ships were damaged, but not destroyed. Engines were offline. Weapons were offline. But life support was intact on every single vessel. Not one Council crew member had been killed. It was not an accident. Reth had given specific orders. Disable. Do not destroy. He had made this decision not out of softness, but out of calculation. Dead soldiers were a tragedy that could be used to fuel anger and build sympathy for the Council's cause. Disabled soldiers sitting alive in powerless ships were a message. A clear, unavoidable message about the difference between what humanity could have done and what humanity chose to do. He opened a channel to the time's enduring authority, which was now drifting without engine power at the back of the debris field. The Vethari admiral came on the line. He sounded, for the first time, like a man who had run out of words. Reth spoke quietly and simply. He said that 340 ships had come into human territory, and that 90 human ships had stopped them without killing a single crew member. He said that the Council should think carefully about that. He said that humanity could have ended every one of those ships. He said that the choice not to do so was a choice, made deliberately, and that the Council should understand what that meant. Then he said the line that was replayed on every network across the galaxy within 24 hours. "We didn't kill your ships. We could have. Go home and explain the difference to your arbiter." He closed the channel. The galaxy had been watching through leaked sensor feeds and observer reports. Across hundreds of star systems, in stations and ships and colonies, beings of 12 species and more watched the replays and read the reports and were very, very quiet for a long time. Humanity had not wanted to fight. Humanity had not wanted to impress anyone. But humanity had been left with no choice, and in having no choice, had shown something that no amount of diplomatic language could have communicated as clearly. They had shown exactly what they were, and they had shown it without cruelty. That was the part that nobody had expected. The galaxy did not change overnight. It never did. But in the weeks after the shatter margin, things began to shift in ways that could not be ignored. The first thing that changed was the Council itself. High Arbiter Vetha returned to the Conclave station from the Armada's failure to find a chamber that no longer felt like hers. The 9 races who had contributed ships were managing their embarrassment in different ways. Some were quiet. Some were pointing fingers. The Torek, whose heavy warships had been among the disabled, released a statement that carefully avoided mentioning the battle at all, which was its own kind of answer. The smaller races who had sent token contributions were furious at having been pulled into what they were now calling the Arbiter's private mistake. The Keth Mercantile Union moved first. 3 weeks after the battle, the senior Keth merchant lord stood before the Council and delivered a formal notice of withdrawal. He was brief and businesslike about it. He said that the Council had failed to protect trade, failed to manage the Rift Corridor crisis, failed to prevent the Usolari-Torek conflict, and had then committed the additional failure of sending 340 ships against a species that had responded with 90 ships and not killed a single person. He said that the Keth Mercantile Union was a commercial civilization, not a military one, and that it had not signed up to be dragged into poorly planned military expeditions. He sat down. The chamber was very quiet. 2 smaller races, the Polari and the Seri, submitted their own withdrawal notices within the following month. The Polari said publicly that they had always felt the Council was dominated by the larger species, and that humanity's departure had only made that clearer. The Seri were more direct. They said that if humanity could build a functioning independent civilization with allied species in just a few months, outside Council control, while the Council itself fell into chaos, then perhaps Council membership was not as necessary as they had been told. High Arbiter Vetha attempted to hold emergency sessions. She called for unity. She used strong language about the importance of collective order. She was not wrong about everything she said, but she had spent too much of her credibility, and the words did not land the way they once had. Within 2 months of the shatter margin, the Council of 12 had become, effectively, a Council of 7. It still existed. It still held sessions, but it was smaller, quieter, and deeply uncertain of its own future. In the outer veil, things were moving in the opposite direction. Bastion Velar was completed. It floated in space, above the largest of humanity's 3 new terraforming worlds, a massive structure of dark metal and blue-lit corridors, its docking bays busy with ships coming and going at all hours. It was not just a fortress. It had become a meeting place. The Orath Collective had sent a full diplomatic mission, led by Venri, who had taken on the role of the Orath's primary representative to humanity. They had moved into a section of Bastion Velar fitted with the atmospheric conditions their species preferred, and had begun working directly with human engineers on joint construction projects. The Orath were extraordinary with structural mathematics, and human engineers quickly developed enormous respect for their methods. The feeling was mutual. Within weeks, they were working together with the easy familiarity of people who had been doing it for years. Two other species arrived after the Orath, the Delhari, a bird-like species from the edge of fringe space, who had watched the Council's collapse from a distance and decided the safer bet was with humanity. And the Messen, quiet ocean-world beings who communicated in long waves of sound and who had an almost unmatched understanding of deep space navigation. Both were welcomed. Both were offered the same basic terms: mutual respect, bilateral agreements, and no senior or junior partners. Everyone equal, everyone heard. The Outer Veil Compact was formalized on a clear day aboard Bastion Villar, in a room that had been built specifically for the occasion. Sarah Voss signed it first, in humanity's name. Then the Orath representative. Then the Delhari elder. Then the Messen diplomat. It was not a dramatic ceremony. There were no speeches, just signatures, and then a shared meal afterward, each species eating their own food at a long table, talking through translation devices, learning the sounds of each other's words. It was small. It was, in the scale of galactic history, a minor document, signed in a brand new station, at the edge of explored space. But it was honest. Every clause in it had been argued over and agreed to by everyone. There were no hidden conditions, no junior partners doing the work, while senior partners collected the credit. It was the kind of agreement that humanity had wanted for 200 years and had never been allowed to have. Then came the harder part. Sarah knew that the compact could not exist in permanent confrontation with whatever remained of the Council. The chaos spreading through Council space was still causing real suffering. Wars, trade collapses, failing infrastructure. People of many species were being hurt by instability that humanity's absence had helped create. That was not something Sarah was comfortable ignoring. So she wrote a letter. It was addressed not to High Arbiter Vetha, but to the individual council members, each one separately. It was written in plain language. It acknowledged that the separation had been painful and disruptive. It said that humanity was not interested in revenge, and was not interested in dominating anyone. It said that the Outer Veil Compact was willing to negotiate trade agreements, mutual aid arrangements, and limited cooperation on shared problems like the rift corridors, with any council member that was willing to engage as an equal partner, without preconditions, and without hierarchy. It said, in simple words, that humanity was not asking to come back to the old table, but it was building a new one, and the seats were open. The responses came slowly, then faster. The Keth replied within a week. They were, predictably, interested in trade. The Torek took longer, their pride making every step difficult. But eventually a message arrived saying that they were willing to discuss the mutual aid portion. 3 of the 7 remaining council members made quiet, unofficial contact through neutral parties, asking if the offer was real. It was real. High Arbiter Vetha never replied. The Vethari Dominion issued no statement. Internally, Reth's contacts reported she was facing the most serious political challenge of her career and had little energy for anything else. Her moment had passed. The galaxy was rearranging itself around something new, and she had not been part of building that something. Months later, when the first rift corridor was repaired under a joint compact Keth technical program, humanities engineers worked alongside Keth funding and Orath mathematical expertise to restore a route that the Council alone had never been able to fix. The corridor opened on a cold, clear day, and the first ship through it was a small Keth freighter carrying medical supplies to a station that had been cut off for months. It was a small thing, but it was real, and it worked. On the observation deck of Bastion Velar, Sarah Voss stood at the wide viewport and watched the stars. Admiral Reth came to stand beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. The stars were very far away, and very still out here, at the edge of explored space, where the maps ran out and the dark began. Reth asked her if she thought the galaxy would ever forgive humanity for leaving. Sarah watched the stars for a long moment. She thought about the 200 years at the bottom of that chamber. She thought about the long corridors she had walked in diplomatic buildings across a dozen worlds. Always careful, always patient, always making herself smaller than she needed to be. She thought about Venri sitting across from Asha in that small meeting pod with its hands folded open in trust. She thought about the Keth freighter going through the repaired corridor with medical supplies. Then she said it quietly, more to herself than to Reth. They don't need to forgive us. They need to understand us. And now, she said, they finally do. Reth looked at the stars for a moment longer. Then he nodded. Once. Outside the viewport, a formation of Orath and human ships was departing together, moving toward the deep frontier, toward the unmapped space beyond the outer veil, toward whatever came next. They flew in easy formation, wing to wing, as if they had been flying together for years. They were just getting started.